Hi, and welcome to the Virtuous Life. I'm Pat Odie Marie, your host, and today this is a book I love, and the reason I wanted to talk about it is obviously because we are in the season of preparing for All Saints Day, which will be coming soon when you hear this interview. And I think we as Catholics have a lot of questions about death, and you've heard the person that I will have on the show today before. He is a wonderful interview. He is a wonderful writer, and it is Randall Smith. He is a professor at St. Thomas Aquinas University in Houston, Texas. He has written many books. His most recent, and I hope I get this right, Bonaventure's Journey of the Mind into God. And he said there's another version of this coming out for people who are a little bit more non-academic, and that will be through Emmaus Press, and it's called Mapping the Mind of Bonaventure's Journey into the Mind of the Mind into God. I think I said that right. But Randall is just a wonderful writer. You can catch him almost weekly at the Catholic Thing. If you've listened to my show before, I do a lot of interviews with authors from the Catholic Thing because it's just a great, great website. And the book we're going to be talking about today is From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body. Welcome, Randall. So nice to have you on the show again.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me.
Well, this book, I love your intro to this book because you talk about cemeteries creeping you out, and how death has not been something that you really wanted to spend a whole lot of time thinking about, but yet you chose to write this book. So tell us why. Why did you choose to write this book with cemeteries creeping you out?
Yeah, no, I do. As I say, writing a book on death, et cetera, was not an easy thing for me because growing up in this culture, many of us, we don't like to think about death. We kind of push death away. We push it into little rooms. It's just not a thing we surround ourselves with, whereas in most of history, of course, people would have had to kind of live with it. People died at home. Funerals were more public. Anyway, but so I grew up in this culture, and so there are people like my wife who like walking through cemeteries and seeing whatever. No, I don't. I'm totally creeped out by cemeteries. I don't like funerals. So I'm very much a product of the culture. But actually, in answer to your question, the way I actually began thinking about the book was not so much about death, was the reverse. Actually, I'd been thinking about and been teaching, about the resurrection of the body, the Christian idea of the resurrection of the body, and trying to make it meaningful for students, in various and sundry ways. And anyway, so there's various ways people think about the resurrection of the body, right? There's various ways people think about what happens after death.
Death, right.
And then also people like, what happens to Jesus, and the point is Jesus dies, but he wasn't really dead, so he was just wounded, and then he was, okay. The point is that doesn't really do anything for us, right? That was an interesting account. Anyway, and so then, there's notions of reincarnation, and there's notions of if you're Plato, your soul just is freed from the prison of your body and goes and reunites with the eternal forms. Anyway, and so I sort of was thinking about none of those are what we mean by the resurrection of the body. So anyway, and that's how I got into the topic. I really came at it from the nicer side of it, right? The Christian side of it. Okay, here's a good thing. Anyway, but then that forced me to kind of have to be oh boy, okay, I have to think about death some. And but I mean, once the only thing which is actually gives you any peace, it seems to me, is precisely this idea of the resurrection of the body.
So, Randall, when you start out this book, you kind of get us to think a little bit about how our beliefs about death affect the way we actually live in this life. And you talk about Epicurus, you talk about the Stoics. Can you kind of let our audience kind of know what were the beliefs of Epicurus and the Stoics, and how did that then affect the way they live? So we can kind of see this, because I think sometimes today, obviously, we see these reflections in our world.
Yeah. No, I mean, the part of the thesis of the book, the overall thesis, goes something like this. People generally throughout history have felt a need, or felt this notion in themselves that there's got to be something after this life, or else this life is ultimately meaningless, right? I mean, you engage in all sorts of activities, you have loves, you have relationships, you care, you build, so many things, and then just nothing. That's
right.
it, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, you also need a notion of the afterlife that doesn't itself render this life meaningless. So if you, if heaven is so great, what are we doing here? Like, why are we cooling our heels now? Right. So
exactly.
Again, and if you have a notion of the afterlife, like, for example, if you read the Odyssey by Homer, or somebody else, anyway, if you read the Odyssey, well, Odysseus goes to the underworld and he meets Achilles, right? And he says, "Oh, Achilles, you're one of the great heroes of all time. You're one of the great Greeks now." And Achilles tells him, "Better to be the slave of some poor farmer and alive than dead," which seems to undermine the entire ideal, right? The Greek ideal. Or if you sort of say, well, you should be very, chaste and, during your life, but then after death, you have sex with 76 virgins or something. Well, then again, it seems like, but then that's a notion of the afterlife, which completely undermines the notion of
what we do.
Life you have.
Right.
So the Stoics, all right, had a notion of, an afterlife, all right. And if you, a lot of them, et cetera, and then the question is, so then you could sort of say, well, there's punishments and rewards. So if you read Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas goes to the underworld, because of course Virgil is sort of redoing the Iliad and the Odyssey. But anyway, and so Aeneas goes to the underworld, and he sees that people who betrayed the country and, were bad in a lot of ways, they get punished. But then the good people, they're in the Elysian fields, and it's all very wonderful. But as I point out, even this is a little dubious because, of course, for a Roman, so here's all these, great souls. They're just cooling their heels, in some lovely field somewhere, and Rome needs them. So, in fact, at the end of that book, part of the Aeneid, Aeneas goes with his father, Anchises, and there's a whole bunch of people at a river. And Aeneas says, "Who are those people?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah. No, they're waiting to go across the river Lethe so they can be reincarnated," right? So he actually has a view of reincarnation. People think maybe Plato also had a notion of reincarnation, which again, it's kind of like, so what? Your soul just is hanging around and doing nothing? So no, it has to come back, right? But of course, the river Lethe, because you have to go across the river because you have to forget everything that you ever learned, any of the relationships you had, et cetera, which again seems to negate the meaningfulness of this life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
it does.
Anyway, that's this sort of Stoic view, rewards and punishments, but with a sense that, but maybe we still need some notion of reincarnation because, what could the afterlife be that would be important enough for us to kind of just stay there? Now, if you're Epicurus and you're an Epicurean, right, then here's the way they deal with it. They're like, well, why does anybody fear death? It doesn't make any sense because for them, like many of us in the modern world, there's just nothing after death. They're like, look, the only reason Epicurus thinks that people fear death is they fear punishment. Like, yeah, you're going to punish and you'll feel bad and whatever. That's just silly, he thinks. Like, no.
Exactly.
There's no reason. You're just obliterated. You're obliterated. You don't feel anything or know anything. And he thinks this takes care of it. Well, I just think that doesn't really work. Right? I think people fear obliteration, nothingness, as much as they fear anything else. So, but, if you're an Epicurean, you just sort of say, well, just kind of live with it. Go to your happy place and try to live a pleasant life. And,
Like, don't
maximize
dwell on
pleasure,
it, right?
minimize pain. Yeah. And
don't think about it.
Don't worry about it. Yeah. And you'll be kind of better off.
Well, the one that confused me in this first chapter, so I think I'm missing something here, so I want you to kind of fill me in, because you're talking about Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, and he talks about this idea of, I think he calls it a being towards death, that it's care for the world, right? That we're really supposed to care for the world. But yet he doesn't believe in an afterlife. So, I mean, but couldn't you, it just doesn't, I can't reconcile that in my head. It's like, well, if you want to care for this world, is it just because this is all there is? Or could you reconcile care for this world with an afterlife? It doesn't have to be one or the other, correct?
Well, that's my view, right? Heidegger, of course, is a modern philosopher, and he thinks, that as many modern people do, that, well, there is no afterlife. You're just a biological organism, and biological organisms die, right? So, but what do we then do about that? He thinks, well, if you, instead of ignoring that, in a kind of Epicurean / Stoic way, right? You sort of say, well, okay, I realize that I'm living towards death, right? Death is a part of human life. Then what do? You're right. You sort of say, well, I care for the world, and as best I can in the time that I have, and that would be one noble way. Now, you're right. But look, are they mutually exclusive? Well, we all know that somebody like Marx, Karl Marx, thought that the problem with Christianity was they had this notion of an afterlife, right? And so that made them ignore, the goods in this world, right? So the notion was that people would, priests or something would say, well, yes, you're all being abused by your employers, but don't worry, because, you'll get it all in heaven or something like that, which, of course, was never really, I mean, you can't say no priest ever said that, but it was not really the message of the church. And as you've seen, I mean, again, throughout history, I mean, this kind of odd criticism which people have, that, if you talk about the afterlife, it makes you not care. You look at the history of the church and you're like, that doesn't seem to be the case at all, right? Yeah. I mean, who were the people who, engaged in charitable activities? Who were the people who were willing to die, for the truth? And the answer is, well, the Christians, actually, precisely because they had a notion of the afterlife. So that's always been a kind of dubious charge. But, if you're Heidegger and you live in that world, then you sort of say to yourself, well, okay, we have to care for this world and, not depend on some afterlife or something like that. And, but yeah, I mean, look, one might say to Heidegger, well, this is an interesting way of approaching it, and there's something noble about it in a way, but I don't know how convincing it's going to be to many people, right? Yeah. I think a lot of people are going to be sort of like, look, if I'm going to die, right? I mean, Heidegger, the German, he's kind of like, well, if we're all just going to die at the end and there's no reward or punishment, there's whatever, well, I'd rather be a Nazi guard than like a Jew in Auschwitz, right? Exactly. Like, better to be the punisher than the punished, right? I don't get that. Like, I'm just going to, maximize my pleasure. I'm just going to, like, do the best I can.
Right. So, and one of the things, probably the last thing I'm going to ask you about this first chapter, but this I found intriguing. You mentioned Becker, and you talk about him and his, there are a couple things that you mentioned that I really kind of were insights for me, especially in the modern day. One was that he believed the attempt to repress the knowledge of our inevitable extinction leads to violence, and we're becoming, I think, it appears to be a really more violent society. And the other is that all power is, in essence, power to deny mortality. I mean, this idea of people that are obsessed with power, and I thought, man, this is a great insight into maybe a lot of what is happening in a society that kind of turns their back on God. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, again, when you forget death, right? I mean, to put it starkly, right? Again,
sure,
and look, the idea isn't that, somehow you don't want to be morbid, but that you forget your own mortality. As the scriptures say, "Oh Lord, let me count my days aright." Well, again, it seems to me that, as we were just saying, then you sort of say, well, I'm living now, and better to be the Nazi guard than the guy the Nazi guard is torturing, right?
So he kind of has this. Does he kind of have the same understanding as? It's almost like he takes the opposite approach of Heidegger. Is that if there isn't an afterlife, then you're going to see violence. You're going to see people struggling to have power over people. Is that kind of, so he doesn't see that it's care for the world if there's nothing after this.
No, that's exactly the point, right? Again, we might say this as kind of it's not, I think, directly, but it might be of Heidegger, which is to say, well, look, if you forget death, okay, well, of course, Heidegger's saying you should keep your mind on death, and then this would somehow, focus your mind in ways that would be caring. And it's kind of like, well, it might, but then again, it might not. On the other hand, right, if you're Becker, then you're sort of saying, look, if you forget about death, all right, then, a lot of people will just exercise their will to power. Right. And again, if you're Nietzsche, you say, yeah, why wouldn't you? Right. That would absolutely be the only reasonable thing, it seems, that you would do, is to kind of say, well, here's the only life I've got, and I better control everything I can control to my benefit. Right. Because if I don't, I'm just an idiot.
Yeah. Well, I want to move into this whole thing on transhumanism, because I find I've been doing a lot of shows on transhumanist professors. So the idea here is that transhumanism is really stemming from this kind of quest for immortality. Is that kind of what we're seeing?
Yeah, the other possibility, of course, right? Again, the book is meant to be sort of set up as a kind of set of logical possibilities, right? Sort of like, well, how could you face death? Well, maybe you could be like an Epicurean. You could simply say, well, it's nothing, right? Exactly. Or you could say, well, how about reincarnation? Or how about, so the issue you're talking about is like, well, what about immortality, right? So the book title is Death, Reflections on Death, Immortality. Right. So the idea of immortality, this is sort of an interesting one, because, again, all the way back to the ancient world, particularly the Greeks and the Romans, there have been, sort of, we might say, fables about immortality. And as the Greeks understood, this is a very bad idea, right? Everybody who wishes for immortality and who gets it, it's a horrible, punishing, despicable thing. So, for example, the people I was just talking about, Aeneas' journey to the underworld. Well, he goes to Cumae, right, where there's a Sibyl, right, like the oracle of Apollo there. And famously, the Sibyl had asked for immortality, right? And that character, the Sibyl, shows up, a line from Tronia shows up at the beginning of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, right? And so the Sibyl asked for immortality, and she was granted immortality, but she forgot to ask for eternal youth. So she just kept getting older and older and older, and so she was totally shriveled, and then she would be in she was put in this jar or something, or some kind of pendulum hanging from the roof. And so at the beginning of the Wasteland, Eliot quotes this line. It says, and the young boys would mock her and say, Sibyl, Sibyl, what do you want? And she would say, I want to die. Yeah. And that's, of course, the beginning of It's the Wasteland. But the point is, look, it's when you think about this, it's a very bad debate. But of course, in the modern world, we have this thing transhumanism would be this idea that you could just have your consciousness downloaded, into some nice software and then transport it into, some other bodies. It's a kind of reincarnation view or something like that. And as though your bodiliness was, secondary to your identity completely. And as though it's happened anyway. And so this is the idea, right, that somehow through this kind of transhumanist ideal, then we can beat death, right? I mean, in other words, people can have immortality.
Right. And I think that you bring up so many good ideas in this section of the book, especially, about what tech companies do as far as, how they keep kind of luring in consumers. So if you keep kind of on this road to updating yourself in a sense, whether it's through, different limbs or different abilities to do things, they've kind of hooked you as a consumer, things like that we never really even think about. And even healthcare costs, what does that do when we continue to push for this kind of immortality? And I think the idea is what you bring up is, what are you living for? And I think that's the question that a lot of people don't really struggle with. They just say, well, I want more life, but what do you want more life for? And I think that really comes out very plain in here. And it also dualism comes out very plain here. And that, I think, is a real issue for us even as Catholics, because a lot of times we kind of take Plato's look at the soul as escaping the body at death, and we don't understand then the physical role of the body. Can you give us a little insight there?
Yeah, and again, look, so if you have the view that, the soul escapes the body at death, and that's the good part of death. Oh yeah, see, the soul, because the body is. I had a student once who said to me, Professor Smith, like, what if the whole point of human life is to find the key to get your body's like a prison, and you have to find the key to get out of the body, right? And to which I said to him, well, look, if that were your view, then you should be about your business, right? Because there would be nothing worse for you than getting to the end of your life and being on your deathbed and saying to yourself, oh my God, I didn't find the key, right? I said, but if you're asking me, I don't find that view particularly, conducive to flourishing. I said, because I don't think of my body as a prison, right? I quite like having a body. I mean, not necessarily this particular body, et cetera, but I like bodily things like hugs and smells and tastes and touch, right? And intimacy. I like those things. I don't think of those as a prison. I don't think, and I'm not sure this kid did either if he thought about it, right? Right. And so the point is but it is true that there's plenty of Christians, weirdly, right, who, even though we repeat in the creed, right, every Sunday at Mass, right, every time we say the creed, resurrection of the body. They don't understand that. What do you mean? So there's a resurrection of the body? But I mean, just Jesus was no, there's a general resurrection. The idea of the Christian death and afterlife is a resurrection of the body. Okay. So, I mean, this is essential to the Christian faith.
So one of the things, and we've just got a couple minutes left here in the first half, you talk about death after the fall could really be a great act of mercy. I love this concept. Can you explain that to the audience?
Well, as I say, right, look, there are some people, Americans get some vacation, and there's a huge proportion of Americans who never even take their 2 weeks of vacation, right? And so there are some people, if they had 700 years of life, would never have a day of rest in 700 years, right? Mm-hmm. They would just be working themselves every moment, all right? It's interesting that 1 out of only 10 commandments, right, is that we should take a day of rest, and it's perhaps the most violated of all the commandments, along with the violation of, honor your father and mother. But the point is, like, there's something about God saying, look, if you don't give yourself a final rest, I will, right? Right? Like, and again, there's something about endless life, which is like, okay, it doesn't focus the mind on like what makes life meaningful. What is the meaningful? And this is where I think Heidegger's trying to get to something like this, just trying to not do it in a Christian way. Like, but we have to think about life. What's it mean, right? What's the meaning of our existence? And if you don't have some notion of like, well, there's a terminus, then those questions just become way too vague. And for most people, as we know, look, when you're a teenager, you think you're invincible and you live forever. It's only when you get a little older, you start to think, oh my God, what's my life been about? What's it supposed to be about? Right.
Right. And I think that whole thing, tying that in with that transhumanist chapter, is that idea that a transhumanist thinks that they can find perfection, but since they're fallen, they don't even know really what perfection is. So it is the Christian understanding of perfection is what's really at the heart of understanding the human person, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's a Christian understanding of the human person, soul, body, mind, et cetera, right? And because, again, the transhumanist is kind of like, well, my body is unimportant, all right? That's like Plato, okay? Yeah. And like reincarnation, like, well, I'll just get a new body. And the point is like, so bodiliness is completely unimportant. Right.
Yeah.
And we discovered this with, during COVID with the problems with distance education. So my bodily presence to my students is unimportant. Turns out not so much. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So again, all the AI people, all the tech people, they live in that world of like, oh, why do we need to be, it's all computer virtual reality. And here's the thing, virtual reality is not reality. Right.
Exactly. Well, I want to let everybody know who we're talking to today. We're talking to Professor Randall Smith. He is a professor at St. Thomas Aquinas in Houston, Texas. He was writer of many books. Look him up; they're great. And check out the Catholic Thing every week. He writes for that a lot, and he is wonderful in that. And we are talking about his book, From Here to Eternity. So in the second half of the show, we're going to dig in more to this. What happens after you die? Okay. What are the beliefs out there and how do we kind of decipher them? So thanks. Come back on the other side of the break. You're listening to The Virtuous Life. I'm your host, Pat Odie Murray.
Do you want to put an end to abortion and the contraceptive mentality for good? Do you want to fight against the homosexual agenda and halt the march towards the legalization of same-sex marriage forever? Do you want to ensure religious freedom for ourselves and for our grandchildren? These things are impossible unless we convert the culture. St. Paul Street Evangelization is a grassroots initiative that recognizes this need and takes it to the streets. If you're interested in peacefully sharing your Catholic faith in a non-confrontational way with the people in your area, you can help. To learn more about St. Paul Street Evangelization, visit us at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com. And don't forget to like us on Facebook.
Hello and welcome back to The Virtuous Life. Today I have one of my favorite people to talk to on The Virtuous Life. He's been on before, Professor Randall Smith. He is a professor at St. Thomas Aquinas University in Houston, Texas. Again, a writer of many books. Just look him up, find his books, and also check out the Catholic Thing online. It's one of my favorite Catholic kind of magazines online to read, and he writes a lot for that online magazine. But today we're talking about his book, From Here to Eternity. And it's an amazing book. We talked kind of about the first couple of chapters, but we want to get into in the second half of the program to talk a little bit more about kind of the things that are out there that maybe we're struggling with, or we've heard other religions might think about the afterlife. How does that all fit? And so I want to get into that the second half of the show. Welcome back, Randall. So good to have you with us today.
No, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, so I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to understand the afterlife. If you're a believer in something after this, why is it important to really kind of have an idea of the afterlife that you're preparing for? Because that's obviously what we're all hoping for.
Well, again, it seems to me that it culturally you can see that notions of the afterlife affect how you live in this life, right? If you don't have a notion of the afterlife, if you're an Epicurean, then you live, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, or a modern kind of Epicurean is Friedrich Nietzsche, then you maximize your will to power. If you have a notion of the afterlife, if it's a serious notion of the afterlife, so for example, I do talk about reincarnation. Now,
yes, you do.
There's American kind of ideas of past lives or something like this. I don't take this to be actually the kind of serious notion of reincarnation that you get in Eastern religions. That's a very serious moral ideal. In other words, the things you do in this life for them affect your next life, right? And of course, the goal on that view is to be free of the cycles of reincarnation. Reincarnation isn't the goal, right? It's the thing you want to be free from. But again, it's a serious idea because the point is the way you live in this life will affect, your either freedom from the cycle or the kind of life you're going to get in the next life. So you have to be very serious about that. And similarly, right, and this is why I don't think it really ultimately would be particularly popular if people took it seriously in the West, which is the things that you're experiencing in this life, the problems, et cetera, could be due to sins you committed in some past life, right? Yeah. That you're now you're responsible for. And you're like, wait a minute, I don't remember that life. I don't remember doing it. It doesn't matter. Right. Now, see, that's a very serious kind of moral ideal. Again, I don't think would be popular in the West if people took it seriously. But also, there is, I think conceptually a problem, which is, again, that crossing the river Lethe. Because the point is like, wait a minute. So my whole life, all the relationships, the children, the things I built, the things I cared for, all of that now essentially had to be zeroed out. So I can live some new life, right? Right. So it's like, but then what was the point of that life other than, this kind of odd cycle that we're in? And the point is like, well, again, that's an issue that it seems to me people who have that notion of reincarnation, people who are Hindu or something, that's a question they have to ask themselves, right? It's a challenge to that religious tradition. And, okay, that's a view, but if you had that view, you'd have to, ask yourself that question. What's the meaningfulness of the whole set of cycles? But anyway, the bottom line is, again, the notion you have of the afterlife, it seems to me, will affect the way you live this life. Or the problem is the notion you have of the afterlife might make this life ultimately meaningless. So again, like for Christians, it's like, oh, we have all these horrible sufferings, but then we go to heaven. The point is, well, what was the point of living this life then? Again, why is God making us cool our heels here just so that we might screw up and we go to hell? I don't get the whole point here. And the point is like, that's a good question. That's a challenge to the Christian idea of living this life in heaven, right? So you have all these sufferings now, but then you get all this wonderful stuff in heaven, and you're just up there. And so you just leave the world behind. And so here we are suffering down here, and you're up there like, well, I'm good.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to kind of ask you, because in this next chapter, you talk about Oliver O'Donovan, and you make a statement, or he makes a statement, certain elite souls who have earned their rewards are rescued from the world and taken off to a better place, leaving the rest behind to fend for themselves and struggle until perhaps one day they too will merit rescue from the Valley of Tears. So is this kind of what people might think of as the rapture? Is this a lot like the rapture? Yeah. Okay.
It is, actually. And O'Donovan's very good about this. That the redemption is not a redemption from the world, like God, takes some people and then rescues them out of the world and takes them somewhere else, right? The redemption is a redemption of the world, right? And we are meant to be a leaven within for the redemption of the world. But yeah, the rapture, the Left Behind, it's a very popular book, I guess, a whole series of books, the Left Behind series. Right. But the notion is that, I guess, right, not having read the book and not having seen it, right? So, but I take it the notion is that, people wake up one day and the raptures happen. And the point is, what's basically happened is God's taken all the good people out of the world, right? They've been, brought to heaven or something like that. And then the rest of the world just has to kind of go on and make their way. And I imagine a person who is left behind, as it were, could be, thank you, God. That was very nice of you. Here are all the good people, the leaven in society, right? And you took them out, and now we're supposed to, it's like having a school and all the best students somehow, leave town. And then the people who run the city are just the people who are the worst criminals, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a good system, one would think.
No.
It's like, that's a loving God that basically, anyway, it's an odd view, but it is one that seems to be popular.
Yeah, it really is. And so when we talk about the idea of this afterlife, right? And we talk about the rapture, we talk about reincarnation. You talk about the West probably, because we talked about the Eastern ideas of reincarnation, but you talk about the West as having what you call a non-moral view of reincarnation. Can you kind of explain that?
Well, yeah. Again, most people, I think, in the West, they're playing around with, again, like my student, like, what if, you're stuck in this prison, which is your body? And the point is like, well, all right, then if you are, then again, you could sort of respect somebody. I not think this would be the way to live towards human flourishing, but the point is you could sort of respect somebody who said, okay, like the Manichees during Augustine's time. So we have to not tie ourselves to the body with pleasure or with sex or with, like, et cetera, et cetera. So you could say, well, okay, you're living out a consistent life. But the point is, I would look at my students, it's like, so if you think that your body is a prison, are you going to try to free yourself from your body right now? Like no beer, no pizza, no going to the football games, no whatever. And of course, the point is like, no, I'm not doing that. And the point is, well, then you don't believe that your body's a prison, right? You're doing everything you can to tie your soul back to your body, right?
Yes.
So, and again, on the reincarnation issue, again, people who believe in past lives, it's I don't want to be overly critical, but it's sort of a joke, right? Again, you don't really think somehow that, I'm suffering now for some horrible things that I did, in some past life. Okay. Right. And generally when people talk about past lives, they're like, oh, I was king this or queen that or some. Nobody goes, oh, in my past life, I was a drunk, who was in a, sewer in ancient Paris or something like, oh, in my past life, I was a rapist and I beat a whole bunch of people up and I was horrible. But so now I have to do penance for that in this life. People don't do that, right?
Right.
Now, if you did do that, that would be kind of serious. But again, part of the problem is that you don't really know what you did in a past life. You just have to presume. Yeah. And again, if you're part of that, then you say, well, whatever I did and I'm suffering, I have to live a virtuous, noble life now. And again, it's kind of like, well, okay, so are people in the West who think about reincarnation, is that something they're doing? Or is it just, again, sort of like, well, I'm Walker Percy, who the great author talks about this. People like to think about, having a different life just because they're bored with this life. Right. It's just a way of escaping their identity, their presence now, right? I think people, again, like Heidegger would say, yeah, that's just silly, right? Like you're just engaging in this notion of like, wouldn't it be nice to wake up one day and have a completely different wife and children and whatever, because I'm kind of bored with this life, right? With this wife and these children and whatever. And that's, I think, not to take this life seriously.
Right. So, okay. So I want to kind of move into this idea of resurrection, and we talked a little bit about it in resurrection and the body of Christ. So you talk about, and we say all the time, Scripture talks about the heavenly city. When they talk about heaven, it always seems like the communion of saints, or there is, or the heavenly banquet, right? That there's going to be lots of people there in a sense. So when we talk about it, then it's heaven isn't this kind of lone experience or lone existence. So it is part of our mission here on earth, in a sense, as Christians, as we prepare, hopefully, to join that heavenly banquet, is that we learn how to love here, that this is a training ground that teaches us how to love and to be and to exist and love others so that we can be ready for that communion of saints.
That's a great way of putting it, I think, actually. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the idea. Similarly, right, we might then say, if we wanted to see, and I think we should see, this relationship between the afterlife and this life, and we ask ourselves, okay, what has God revealed? Like in the Christian tradition, what has God revealed about the afterlife? My claim is that the definitive revelation of what the afterlife will be was given in and through, or we might say by, right, the risen Christ. And what we see in Christ risen from the dead is that it's a bodily resurrection from the dead, right? And also that with a glorified body, right? But still there's a retaining of his identity. It's still the same Christ. He has the wounds, right? When he addresses Mary or the 11 in the upper room, they recognize him, and so there's a deep identity, right? So it's the person, and so in other words, instead of that idea of like, well, you're a little drop of water that goes and returns to the ocean. Well, when the drop of water gets back to the ocean, it just disappears.
Right.
What gives us hope that we can retain our personal identity, that it's still us? Well, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. By the same token, we're united fully with God and enjoy that union with God. But again, the long tradition is that to be united with God or to see the face of God is to be completely obliterated. And the idea that somehow we could be united with God but not be obliterated is, again, revealed to us in the bodily resurrection of Christ. Then, as you've said, right, the important point as well, at least for Catholics in particular, is the idea of the communion of saints, right? We're united with God, but we don't lose our personal identity. Okay. But also we don't lose our connectedness. So one of the things, again, I think people really, really fear about death is they will lose their loved ones, right? And their loved ones will lose them. The people I love and care about, et cetera, I'm going away. It's kind of like heaven is going to Cleveland and, you live in LA or something. And then, I have to go to Cleveland now. Or you're in Cleveland and, anyway, I'm going to Florida, but I have all my friends here. Whereas it strikes me that precisely the idea of the communion of saints is that you don't lose the people you love, right? You're united with them in a more intimate way through the beatific vision, through being united with Christ, right? So Christ now, after his resurrection from the dead, right, and we become members of his body, Christ after the resurrection of the dead can be present now, right, even though the doors and windows are locked, he can be present to them bodily. He doesn't have the same, this glorified body doesn't have the same restrictions that our body does, right? The problem with our bodiliness is that when you're with the people you love in Houston, you can't be with the people you love in Cleveland. And when you're people you love in Cleveland, you can't anyway. Whereas here, now, God can be bodily present in and through the Eucharist throughout time and history, right? It doesn't have the same limitations of time and place in quite the same way, right? So again, you can be present to your loved ones in an even more intimate way, not restricted by time and place, right? So again, we might say, so what does the afterlife tell us about this life? Well, if we say, for example, that it's a bodily resurrection, what that would tell us is our bodily existence is not a prison or a bad thing, okay? The other thing it would tell us is that what are we going to be doing in the afterlife? And the answer is, well, precisely what we want people to be doing in this life, loving each other, praying for each other. That's the idea of the communion of saints, right? What do we think is going on with the communion of saints? They're praying for us. They're loving for us. They're caring for us through all eternity, right? The way they were when we loved them in this life. So you have a beloved grandmother, and you would go to her and you say, "Oh, Grandma, can you pray for me? I've got this hard thing." And she's like, and you know she will, because you know she loves you. The point is, after she's dead, it doesn't stop, right? Nothing can stop that kind of love. So again, what we should be doing in this life is essentially what we would be doing in heaven, right? Only in a more perfect way. So there's no that same disjunction between this life and the next life.
I think for a lot of people, there is the reason we don't kind of understand maybe the resurrection of the body is because, when you look at scripture, okay, 3 days, Jesus died on Friday, rose on Sunday. Okay, there it is. There's the glorified body. But, we know we put that body of our loved one in the grave, and yet we talk about their spirit or their soul going on. And so for us with this time and space thing, it's really hard because, well, when does that resurrection of the body occur? Are they just a soul until that resurrection occurs? Do you understand where I'm going with this?
Yeah, this is an issue and continues to be an issue. And I don't approach it in the book. There is, in fact, a theological debate between those who think, that you don't survive death because you don't have a body, and your identity is bound up with your body, and so basically there's no you until the end of time, until the resurrection of the body. So there is this debate. And I find this debate kind of tedious myself, and am not very interested in it.
Right.
But here would be the only thing I would say about it. I mean, it's intellectually, legitimate. It just seems to me, here's what I would say, that the church would have to say. It can't be the case that St. Francis, that Francis of Assisi does not exist. Okay. Right. Because people pray to St. Francis, right? So it has to be the case that there is some way in which Francis of Assisi and Dominic and, Mary, the Mother of God, et cetera, that they exist, right? And it also is the case that the church affirms that after death people enjoy the beatific vision, right? So those are the only two things that I think you absolutely have to sort of say. What you want to say about the existence of the glorified body and the quote-unquote end of time is a different issue, right? And an interesting and important issue, but it just seems to me that the thing we really want to say and focus on in terms of, our notion of the afterlife is simply that, right, you have a glorified body. It's not something which is unbodily, number one. And number two, again, the love you have for God and for neighbor is not something that even death can destroy, right? Again, the love you have for the world, for God, for your neighbors, for your children, for your grandmother, for your wife, these are things that don't die with you, right? They are resurrected. They live on in and through the resurrected Christ. That's the idea, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And that those people are alive now with us, praying, loving us, right? We haven't lost them. They didn't go to Cleveland. If you're listening to this in Cleveland, it's a wonderful place. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the point is, I'm in Houston, right? It's not like, oh, they went to Miami. Right. No, they're present to us now at every moment, even more intimately.
One of the things that you bring up too that I think I hear kids obviously say this kind of stuff, but it is the created order, right? How does the created order, the good things that God has created in the natural world, how does that play a role in the afterlife? Because you mention it about, flowers and dogs and meadows and trees and ice cream. Yeah. Can you kind of give us an insight into that?
Well, Oliver O'Donovan, by the way, if people haven't read Oliver O'Donovan, he's tremendous writer, theologian, not a Catholic, but Anglican of that Anglo-Catholic sort. And he's just tremendous. And so two things. First of all, Oliver O'Donovan, in his book on an evangelical ethics, and he doesn't mean evangelical in the way we mean it. He means like in terms of the gospel. Says that Christian ethics has to be based on the gospel, and at the heart of the gospel message is the resurrection of Christ from the dead. And he says the resurrection of the Christ from, I think he's right about this, the resurrection of Christ from the dead reaffirms the created order that God has made at the beginning, right? God isn't destroying the created order. God is redeeming the created order. So that's the first thing that we want to say, right? That somehow, again, a heavenly idea somehow doesn't mean that our body or the created order or, that any of that becomes or is in this life unimportant. It's a reaffirmation of that. But then the second thing is, again, people come to me all the time. I mean, not every day, but a lot, and they're like, "Hey, are there going to be dogs in heaven?" Or
exactly.
Are there going to be tacos in heaven or something? So many people ask that, but like what's heaven going to be like? And of course, there's all these images of people on fluffy clouds, and they're like, "I like grass." I mean, I don't think that. And it's kind of like, yeah, those are artistic images, right?
Right.
That usually are put on the ceilings of churches, and it's like above. But that's not. So here, this is my answer to that question. Look, God is the source of all, on the Christian view, right? The source of all being and goodness in the universe. Mm-hmm. So anything that's good here that you experience cannot be absent from God, right? So again, it'd be sort of like, Teresa always tells, like, if somehow you got to heaven, right, and God was like, whoa, taco stands. I never thought of that, right? I mean, gee, gosh, these people, they invent all this incredible stuff. It's like, no, look, anything that is good here cannot possibly be absent from God, who is the source of all goodness. So I don't know about your dog, but the point is, whatever there is good about dogs and grass and trees and sunsets and whatever, and, husbands and wives, et cetera, cannot be absent from God, who is the source of all goodness, right? That's
I like that.
Now, again, all the evil that we somehow put into it, that would be missing. Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
But I just think that that's the ultimate answer to that, which is to say, look, I have no particular, knowledge of the afterlife, obviously, other than, I think, that's revealed to us in the crucified and risen Christ.
Right.
But also, I think with Oliver O'Donovan, that the crucifixion, the resurrection, the bodily ascension of Christ reaffirms the created order, but also because it's related to the book of Genesis, right? In the Gospel of John, it begins, in the beginning was the Word. What we realize is it's the same God who created. It's good, very good. Nothing in this world that is good could possibly be absent from the God who's the creator of all goodness.
I love that. So we've only got a couple of minutes left, Randall, and I do want to hit on something because the last two chapters have tons of stuff and I got tons of questions. But I want to just hit on this because you make the statement that we have forgotten how to bury our dead. And it is not a trivial thing not to know how to bury the dead. Can you give us some insight into what you're thinking here when you talk about this in your chapter on facing death?
Yeah, as a person who's weirded out by cemeteries, I'm a person who thinks that this is not a good thing, right, in me and in the culture, and that it would be very, very important, actually, to for the church to rediscover and to bring back into itself, right, how to bury the dead. All funerals should be in churches, right? I know they're dead, but again, the viewing, the rosary, the whatever should be in the church. The church should take it. And I'm a huge proponent of churchyards, namely, right, people should be buried around the church. Every church should have a cemetery around it. As if you go to England, the old churches there, for example, and there's in other places, and it used to be the case in America, would have churchyards around them, right? So that if your mother, your elderly mother died or your grandmother, it would be buried in the church where she went and so if you went to mass there, you would be able to visit and say, oh yeah, okay. And so the images, the memories of those who went before us should be all around us all the time. right?
Yeah.
There would be nothing better for the church, I think, than to, when people have this horrible experience of death, to say, this is something we take on, right?
Mm-hmm.
We will take care of the whole business, right? There's a whole huge industry now. And the point is like, no, we can handle all of this, right? So very inexpensively, we'll bury them out here. There'll be, a simple cross, et cetera, et cetera. You can visit your loved one, every Sunday or throughout the week or something. Instead, we push it off into some, field somewhere that no one can go. And it's really quite tragic, I think.
Yeah.
By the way, I had this view. I'd written something about this, and then I had a guy come to me and he goes like, I thought this was really a great idea. So I went to the bishop's office and I said, hey, how about churchyards? And the guy there said, oh, no. The bishop doesn't want churchyards. He doesn't want that, because if you have a churchyard around a church, it makes it impossible to close the parish.
Oh my, that's not a good way to look at it, is it?
No, I said, if a church found that out, if they were like, whoa, okay, I think they would immediately go out and bury 5 people in their churchyard, right? Because they'd be like, no, Bishop, we are putting down roots. That's the idea, right? We are putting down roots. We belong here and we are staying here, right? And you could tell it because we buried our parents here.
Yeah. Oh, Randall, I could talk to you forever, especially about these last 2 chapters. But thank you so much for being with us today. You are amazing. I want to let the audience know, Randall Smith, professor at St. Thomas Aquinas in Houston, the book we are talking about today. And I would encourage you, as you prepare for the feast of the All Saints Day and Poor Souls Day, this is a great book to read. It really gives you a lot to think about and to chew on, and it's called From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body. Thanks so much, Randall, for being with us.
Thank you.
And I would, again, encourage you to read anything that Randall writes. It's amazing. And I think we need to, as St. Benedict says, think about and reflect on our deaths daily. I think that would be a good preparation for us as we move toward All Saints Day. So have a blessed week ahead. Thanks for listening to The Virtuous Life. I'm your host, Pat Odie Murray.